of just how many people were watching. The banks of television studios and hundreds of cameras from worldwide media clearly visible. On the forecourt of Buckingham Palace, the Guard of Honour, made up by the Welsh Guards, was waiting. More than 100 men. And the band of the 1st Battalion, the Welsh Guards. And so their carriage rolled through the gates of the palace that will one day be their home. On the carriage ride, Catherine had asked her husband whether he was happy now. He had left her in no doubt that the answer was yes. The service, he had said, had been beautiful. And he told her how proud he was that she was now his wife. In the central courtyard, with a helping hand from her husband, the Duchess climbed carefully out of her carriage. They were welcomed, and no doubt congratulated, by the master of the Queen's household, Air Vice Marshal David Walker. And so into the palace to prepare for the official photographs and the first of 2 receptions. For the crowds outside, there was still a grand procession to watch and enjoy. As the Queen and Duke arrived home, she was heard to say the whole spectacle had been amazing. And for someone who normally keeps her emotions very private, that was a measure of how special the day had so far been. for Mr. and Mrs. Middleton the grandest ride to Buckingham Palace they will ever experience, as they travelled in the Australian state coach with Prince Charles and the Duchess of Cornwall. Next came one of the great set pieces of any royal wedding: the appearance of the newlyweds and the rest of the royal family on the palace balcony. But before that could happen, everything and everyone had to be in place. The pomp and circumstance of a royal wedding is steeped in hundreds of years of tradition. And what a spectacle for the crowds. Martin Brunt, Sky News crime correspondent, was watching.
For the capital's police, keeping the peace around the royal wedding was one of the biggest challenges they had faced for many years. Security, crowd control and safety. They were all issues full of potential difficulties that could have spoiled the big day. There were 1 million people on the street and a global live TV audience of 2 billion. The Metropolitan Police could not afford to get it wrong. From its nearby headquarters at New Scotland Yard, the force had been planning its operation for many weeks. In the end, 5,000 police officers, joined by military personnel, ensured that the pomp and ceremony went uninterrupted. Perhaps the biggest challenge came after the service, moving thousands of revellers towards Buckingham Palace. Nobody wanted to miss the royal balcony appearance.
In a well-rehearsed and highly disciplined operation, hundreds of police formed a human chain to shepherd tens of thousands of well-wishers as close to the palace as possible.
For those who couldn't get close to the route of the wedding procession, giant screens were erected in Hyde Park. They ensured that nobody missed a moment of the celebrations. The police commissioner, Sir Paul Stevenson, had told his officers that morning they should appreciate the honour of being involved. And how they did. They could enjoy their role as the traditional, friendly bobby on the street, an increasingly rare opportunity in the modern world.
Before long, the Mall became a sea of Union flags as the huge crowds moved slowly forward.
At the Victoria Memorial, 500,000 people were marshalled gently into place.
Everyone was hoping they would get right up to the palace gates for the big moment.
The officer in charge of this unprecedented operation said, with some obvious relief, that it had been an amazing success. And who would argue with that? It was a captivated audience. A vast army of Middle England royalists, young and old. There were Londoners, away-day travellers, and overseas visitors.
At 1:25, the curtains behind those famous balcony doors began to twitch. The lucky few who'd made it all the way to the railings primed their cameras. And then, right on cue, the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge stepped onto the balcony. "Wow," said Catherine. And William, too, though used to great royal occasions such as this, seemed taken aback at the sheer volume of the crowds. Awesome, he seemed to say. The Queen led the rest of the family out. Slowly they all found their place. For Carol and Michael Middleton, this surely must have been the moment when the reality of the extraordinary transition their daughter had now made hit home. Something approaching 1 million people were cheering their girl. She was their princess, their duchess, their future queen. And by rights, Mr. and Mrs. Middleton would now be expected to curtsy to their own daughter. Catherine herself looked supremely happy and thoroughly at home with her new in-laws. She was proving time and again that she's a mature young woman who's entered into a unique lifestyle with her eyes wide open. All of this was fascinating for the crowds, but everyone knew what they were really waiting for: the couple's first public kiss. The roar of approval seemed to stretch all the way back to Admiralty Arch. For one little bridesmaid, though, Grace Van Curtsum, it all seemed a bit much. She put her hands over her ears and scowled. Prince Charles was taking a grandfatherly interest in his wife's little granddaughter, Eliza. William, it seemed, had rather enjoyed the effect his kiss had had on the crowds. He knew they wanted more. One more? He asked his wife. This time he lingered longer. The crowds went into a frenzy. There was one last spectacle, a wedding tribute from the Battle of Britain memorial flight. Over London's skyline thundered a Lancaster, flanked by a Spitfire and a Hurricane, great symbols of British resistance during the war years. And an even deeper roar when they were followed, precisely 30 seconds later, by two state-of-the-art typhoons and two tornadoes, blasting overhead in box formation. It was the Queen who decided it was time for the wedding celebrations to move back into the privacy of the palace. 650 guests were waiting for the reception to get fully underway. The Queen's chefs had prepared 10,000 canapes, and there was plenty of champagne to be enjoyed. As her husband led her back through the palace doors, Catherine couldn't resist one last look over her shoulder. A very special memory of a very special wedding day. For the crowds around the palace and along the wedding route, the party had already lasted many hours. But all over the country, other street parties were just getting going. Thousands were held in towns and villages up and down the land. And of course, this was an extra bank holiday, with Easter creating 2 four-day weekends in a row. The country was in the mood for fun. The parties gave children a special memory to take with them into later life. A memory of the time everyone joined together to mark a new milestone in the history of an ancient monarchy. It had been announced that William and Catherine would be heading back to Clarence House for a rest before the evening celebrations, but no one expected them to make the short journey in quite the style they did. Would it be a Rolls-Royce? Or a Bentley? Or the State Landau again? No. This was going to be a modern end to a traditional wedding celebration. The crowd peered. An engine started. Was that really the future monarch driving his father's old blue convertible? An Aston Martin given to Prince Charles on his 21st birthday? In the passenger seat, Catherine, still wearing the gown in which she had made her vows a few hours earlier, clearly thought it was hilarious. As the car rolled out of the gates of the palace, astonishment quickly turned to cheers. They drove slowly, giving the crowds as close a view as possible. And they both looked delighted when, overhead, a bright yellow Sea King helicopter made a surprise fly past. a wedding tribute to the search and rescue pilot Prince. The number plate bore all the hallmarks of a plan dreamt up by best man Prince Harry, along with the L plate and the balloons.
Jenny, the biggest surprise of the day, must have given the police an extra headache. But despite the security concerns, it was possible for a royal heir and his bride to drive themselves between two palaces. Of course, there were protection officers in a vehicle behind them, but this was a remarkable, fun scene in a country that's had its security problems in the past.
William was enjoying being behind the wheel, motoring sedately down towards Stableyard Road. And then, as quickly as the moment had begun, it ended. The car disappeared through the gates of Clarence House. The Dude and the Duchess, as Prince Harry later dubbed them, were gone. A day that had started with so much expectation from the crowds and the country was almost over. But what a day it had been. From fairy tale dresses to balcony kisses, trees in the Abbey to balloons on the car. This had been a remarkable royal wedding, and one that neither they nor we will ever forget. At the Abbey, the Queen seemed animated as she chatted with Carol Middleton and the Duchess of Cornwall. The livery worn by the footmen and coachmen are, wherever possible, antique and original. The newlyweds were given a captain's escort, commanded by William's close friend, Major Nicholas Van Kutsen, 12 troopers of the Life Guards, and 12 of the Blues and Royals. What an experience for the newest member of the royal family. More than 150 horses were on duty. 1,000 service men and women lined the route. 5,000 police officers managed the crowds, and despite fears of disruption or disorder, the security operation was later universally praised. And these were the scenes that everyone had waited patiently to see. The pure pageantry of a royal wedding. The second in line to the throne, en route to the palace where, with his new wife, he will one day reign as king. For the coachman, a huge responsibility. Riding the lead was Alan Parry, who's been at the Royal Mews for a decade, and John Nelson, a veteran of royal occasions, who's worked at the Mews for 43 years. The carriage itself, with its crimson satin seats and red leather, was restored just a few years ago. For the Queen, the Scottish state coach was chosen instead of an open-top carriage because of the threat of rain.